The year was 1853, and the southern sun glared over the Beaumont plantation, casting long, oppressive shadows across the cotton fields that stretched like a pale sea toward the horizon. Lillian Beaumont, the plantation owner's daughter, moved silently through the manor halls, her delicate shoes muffled against the polished floorboards, yet the weight of her conscience pressed louder than any footstep. She had grown up in a world of wealth, privilege, and secrets, the kind sewn into the very fabric of the estate, hidden behind carved doors and veiled conversations. The estate's enslaved population worked under the scorching sun, their hands blistered, their voices muted by fear, yet Lillian had always noticed one in particular, Samuel. His presence was calm, intelligent, and careful, but his eyes betrayed a knowledge and resilience far beyond his station. Over the years, their quiet understanding had grown a dangerous, forbidden connection, delicate as the brittle pages of a diary, yet undeniable. Rumors of freedom had begun circulating among the enslaved, whispers of the Underground Railroad, coded signals passed from hand to hand, directions hidden in quilts, and safe houses scattered through swamps and forests. Freedom existed, but it was distant, elusive, and deadly to reach. On a humid spring evening, after the cicadas had begun their relentless song, Samuel approached Lillian in the privacy of the servants' quarters. His voice was steady, betraying nothing, yet carried an urgency she could not ignore. "Tonight, we leave tonight." The words were simple, but their meaning thundered in her chest. Danger lurked in every shadow, every patrolman's gaze, every loyalist neighbor. One wrong move meant death, or worse, the brutal retaliation her father could exact. She hesitated only a moment before realizing she could not remain in a gilded cage, not when freedom and survival waited just beyond the horizon. That night, cloaked in darkness, they slipped through the fields, past guard dogs and lantern-lit porches, every step measured, every breath a prayer. The path took them into thick forests where moonlight barely penetrated, where every snapping twig felt like a gunshot and every rustling leaf a herald of doom. Hunger gnawed at them. Fatigue weighed down their limbs, yet neither spoke of despair. They survived on whispered guidance and the coded signals Samuel knew, markers carved into trees, stones stacked in patterns, and abandoned cabins offering brief refuge. Nights were the cruelest. The wind carried scents of decaying leaves, the echo of far-off hounds, and the faint, mocking laughter of the world they had left behind. Lillian, whose life had been one of privilege, now navigated the darkness as if reborn. Her understanding of fear, trust, and courage shifted with each step, each mile northward. Over weeks, through snow-slicked paths and hidden tunnels, they encountered others seeking freedom, some guiding, some betraying. The weight of decisions, whom to trust, when to hide, when to run, etched itself into Lillian's mind. They were hunted yet persistent, lost yet guided by the promise of liberty. And then, after months of flight, traversing forests, rivers, and the open plains, they glimpsed a northern town, modest and alive, its streets unafraid, its people breathing air untainted by the chains of slavery. Relief should have washed over them, but it did not. Something was wrong. Signs of pursuit lingered, the feeling of being watched, shadows that moved against logic, and a warning in the whispering wind. Freedom came with a price, one they could not yet comprehend. The choices made in these first few weeks, the alliances forged, the dangers faced, the betrayals, and acts of courage would shape the lives of both Lillian and Samuel in ways that were unimaginable. The town they had hoped would be sanctuary held secrets, and what they found 6 months later would reveal not just the horrors of a nation built on oppression, but the resilience, cunning, and defiance of two souls willing to risk everything for freedom. The northern town welcomed them with cautious curiosity, its streets cobblestone and narrow, houses painted in faded pastels, smoke curling from chimneys into a gray sky. Lillian and Samuel moved carefully, aware that freedom was not an absence of danger, but a shifting landscape of unknown threats. They found refuge in a small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Hawthorne, a woman who had once sated runaway slaves and whose eyes carried both kindness and a sharp, wary intelligence. Here they were given bread and water, a bed in a corner room, and most importantly, silence. The world outside the walls of the house hummed with normalcy, laughter of children, merchants calling out from shop fronts, and church bells marking the passage of time. Yet inside, the air was thick with tension. Samuel's gaze never strayed from the streets, scanning for signs of pursuit. Lillian, whose life had been a series of carefully arranged comforts, now had to learn to read the subtle cues of danger, the flick of a shadow, the unusual stillness of a passerby, the sound of a door closing too sharply. As days passed, they began to rebuild their lives in fragments, each moment of normalcy a fragile mask over the lingering terror. Samuel found work at the docks, his hands skilled and steady, while Lillian assisted Mrs. Hawthorne with sewing and mending. Yet even in these simple routines, the weight of the past pressed relentlessly on their shoulders. Rumors had reached the town of bounty hunters and slave catchers, men who traveled with forged papers and merciless intent. Lillian's father, she had learned through hidden letters intercepted along their journey, had placed an enormous bounty on Samuel's head and, heartbreakingly, on her own should she be found aiding him. Sleep was elusive. Dreams were haunted by the screaming fields of the plantation, the cries of those left behind, and the shadows that seemed to move closer each night, pressing against the windows with invisible hands. Then, one evening, 6 months after their flight, a letter arrived, folded meticulously, sealed with wax, and bearing no return address. Lillian's hands shook as she broke the seal, revealing a single sheet of parchment inscribed. In her father's unmistakable hand. The words were chilling. "I know where you are. I know who helped you. You cannot hide from the past. You have 6 days. Panic surged through her chest, an icy hand squeezing her heart. Samuel's calm composure, usually a fortress against fear, faltered for the first time. They had come north seeking freedom, but freedom had a new face now, one that was both terrifying and relentless. Mrs. Hawthorne, sensing the urgency, provided maps, safe routes, and warnings of men known to hunt fugitives, yet even these precautions felt insufficient. Lillian realized that the town, which had seemed a haven, was a fragile veil over a world still shadowed by vengeance and obsession. She and Samuel made a decision. They would leave the town under cover of darkness, retracing some of the paths they had taken months ago, hoping to reach another safe haven farther north where the reach of her father could not follow. The journey was harrowing. They moved through forests thick with snow and ice, across rivers that bit at their feet, through swamps that whispered with the hiss of unseen creatures. Each night they slept fitfully, dreams filled with the echo of their past lives and the haunting uncertainty of what awaited them in the shadows. And then, in a clearing illuminated by pale moonlight, they discovered a cabin, small, sturdy, seemingly abandoned yet stocked with food and firewood. It bore the mark of those who aided the escapees of the Underground Railroad, a symbol carved discreetly into the door. Relief should have been immediate, but as they stepped inside, a sound froze them in place, the faint creaking of a clock, ticking with a deliberate, menacing rhythm. It was old, its face cracked, hands frozen at midnight, but the sound was alive, resonating deep in their bones, as if measuring the moments of their existence. The clock, a relic from another time, carried with it the weight of countless stories, lives measured and ended, a subtle reminder that the past had not released them, that the chains they thought they left behind were not merely physical but woven into the very air they breathed. In that instant, Lillian understood a chilling truth. Their journey for freedom was only beginning, and the shadow of the plantation, the obsession of her father, and the relentless grasp of a society built on cruelty would follow them, patient, clever, and infinitely persistent. The cabin offered temporary shelter, but the ticking of the clock was a constant reminder that danger had a rhythm of its own, unrelenting, inevitable. Lillian and Samuel took turns keeping watch, eyes scanning the darkened woods for movement, ears straining for the faintest hint of pursuit. They ate sparingly, conserving what little food was left, and spoke only in whispers, aware that every sound might carry beyond the walls, drawing attention they could not afford. Days passed with agonizing slowness, the outside world indifferent to their terror, yet every creak of a branch or rustle in the snow made their hearts hammer like drums. One evening, as a storm approached, painting the sky in shades of charcoal and silver, a stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing, a man cloaked in a heavy coat, face obscured by the brim of his hat, hands empty and visible in a gesture of peace. Samuel instinctively stepped in front of Lillian, ready to defend, but the man's voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of knowledge and the promise of guidance. "I know who you are. I know what you seek. You cannot run forever, but you can survive if you follow." Suspicion warred with hope. Lillian wanted to run, to hide, but something in the stranger's posture, the way he moved with certainty and patience, compelled her to listen. He revealed that he had once worked with her father, but had turned against him after witnessing the cruelty he inflicted, and had since dedicated his life to helping those the plantation sought to control. He offered a map, detailed and coded, marking safe paths, hidden cabins, and communities sympathetic to their cause, stretching farther north than they had ever dared to imagine. Yet he also warned of the Watchers, men hired by Lillian's father, relentless, intelligent, and cruel, trained to read the patterns of escapees, to anticipate every movement. "They are everywhere and nowhere," he said, voice low. "They move with the wind, vanish into the night, and leave only the echoes of your steps to guide them. That night, they followed his instructions, moving silently through frozen woods, crossing frozen streams that reflected the pale moonlight, their breaths forming clouds that mingled with the mist. Every sound was magnified, the snap of a twig, the distant howl of a wolf, the faint crunch of snow underfoot. Lillian's mind raced, alternating between terror and determination, understanding that each step was a gamble, each choice a potential trap. By dawn, they reached a ridge overlooking a small settlement, its lights dim, but present, a cluster of cabins and homes where freedom was not just a dream but a fragile, guarded reality. They descended carefully, avoiding the main roads, and were greeted by a community that had existed quietly for decades, providing shelter, work, and education to those fleeing bondage. Here, Lillian and Samuel could breathe, if only briefly, feeling the weight of months of fear begin to ease. But safety was an illusion. Even in the warmth of the settlement, shadows of the past lingered. Letters arrived from distant relatives, warnings disguised as friendly notes, and sometimes the sound of hooves at night disappearing, as quickly as they came, reminded them that her father's reach was long and that the world was still structured to favor his power. Yet in this fragile haven, Lillian also found courage, learning the skills of survival, the subtle art of blending into a world that seemed indifferent to those who had escaped its cruelty. Samuel taught the children of the settlement, sharing the knowledge and resilience he had carried through months of flight, while Lillian worked with the women to organize safe routes, gather intelligence, and train others in secrecy, transforming fear into strategy. And then, 6 months into their stay, a new message arrived, delivered, not by hand, but by the wind, a piece of parchment that appeared atop their cabin door, edges curling as if burned by an invisible flame. It bore a single line: "The clock begins again." Lillian's blood ran cold. The words were not a threat, they were a statement, a certainty. Somewhere, in a place buried deep beneath the earth, the mechanisms of power, cruelty, and vengeance were still alive, still counting time, and they were aware of her. Samuel placed his hand on her shoulder, voice steady but tense. "We knew this wouldn't end. We have to move before it starts sticking toward us." Their journey, they realized, was far from over. Freedom was never granted. It was carved out in moments of courage, in steps taken through snow and shadow, in defiance of a past that would not let them go. With dawn breaking, they prepared to leave the settlement behind, following the coded maps, guided by whispers of safe paths, knowing that every mile brought them closer to survival, but also closer to the inevitable confrontation with the forces that had hunted them since the first day of their escape. The forest that morning seemed alive, not with birds or the wind, but with anticipation, as though the trees themselves held their breath and the snow beneath Lillian and Samuel's feet whispered secrets of those who had passed this way before. The coded map guided them, but it required interpretation, symbols marking which trees to pass, which streams to cross, which hollows would shelter them from prying eyes. Every step demanded vigilance. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the pale light, and the wind carried faint, eerie sounds that might have been distant voices, or perhaps the echoes of their own anxieties. By mid-morning they encountered remnants of another escape, a series of symbols carved into bark and stone, directions left by those who had fled before them, warnings and subtle encouragements hidden in shapes and patterns that only a practiced eye could decipher. Samuel, with his experience, led the way, while Lillian followed close, noting every detail, memorizing landmarks that might save or doom them in the future. Then, without warning, the snow shifted oddly beneath them, as if the ground itself was aware of their presence. A faint, metallic scent filled the air, chilling them more than the cold ever could. Lillian paused, sensing movement from behind a dense thicket. She froze, heart hammering. A man emerged, cloaked in dark fabric, face partially concealed, eyes sharp and calculating. Samuel stepped in front, tense, ready to confront, but the man lifted his hands, empty and calm, speaking in a low, steady tone. "You seek freedom, yet freedom always carries its price. The path ahead is treacherous but necessary. Will you follow it, knowing what lies in wait?" Lillian exchanged a glance with Samuel, both understanding the gravity of the choice. The stranger handed them a small, folded piece of paper, a continuation of the coded map, with instructions more complex, cryptic, almost like a riddle. It warned of patrols, hunters, and natural traps, but also marked safe havens and allies who could provide food, shelter, and guidance. They followed the directions cautiously, moving through icy streams and up steep ridges, each mile feeling like a trial, each bend in the path bringing new dangers. The hunters were always nearby, or maybe they were illusions, but the fear they invoked was very real, pressing against Lillian's chest, making it difficult to breathe. As evening approached, they reached a dilapidated cabin tucked into a copse of pine trees. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a sign of life, but also a possible trap. Approaching slowly, they found an elderly woman who introduced herself as a former overseer of a nearby safe community, now dedicated to protecting those fleeing slavery. She offered warmth, food, and guidance, yet her eyes held knowledge of horrors they were only beginning to grasp. Over the fire she recounted tales of previous escapees, some who made it, some who never returned, and all the while hinted at the invisible network of people who monitored the forests, the rivers, and the roads, people who knew how to vanish into the shadows and watch. That night, as snow fell steadily outside, the cabin's small lantern flickering against the walls, Lillian studied the paper once more, realizing that the journey ahead required not just endurance and stealth, but intuition, courage, and a willingness to confront both human cruelty and the haunting remnants of the past. Outside, distant cries echoed in the darkness, wolf, wind, or something else entirely, and Lillian pressed Samuel's hand, her resolve hardening. They had survived this far, but the path forward promised more than cold and hunger. It promised tests of spirit, morality, and cunning. And somewhere, beyond the next ridge, the ghosts of the plantation, the men who hunted, and the history that had long denied them justice, waited to see if these two could truly escape, or if they too would become whispers in the woods, remembered only by the snow, the trees, and the cold, unyielding wind. At first light, Lillian and Samuel left the cabin, each footstep muffled by the freshly fallen snow, the weight of the night's tales pressing on their minds as heavily as their packs. The woman's warnings echoed in Lillian's ears. Paths could twist, hunters could lie in wait, and the forest itself could betray them, but the fire of determination burned hotter than any fear. They moved cautiously, following the cryptic lines and symbols etched on the fragile paper, which now felt like a lifeline rather than a map. The woods were thick, twisted, and silent, yet alive with subtle movements. Snow-laden branches creaked under invisible burdens. Small animals scuttled in shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the occasional hollow gust of wind whispered words they could almost recognize, like fragments of forgotten conversations. Hours passed with no sign of human presence, yet the sense of being observed grew, prickling their skin, setting their nerves on edge. Samuel paused, noticing tracks partially hidden beneath the snow, too precise to be animal, too irregular to be accidental. Lillian followed his gaze and saw faint impressions of boots, flattened and unnervingly deliberate, leading deeper into a valley shrouded in mist. Fear gnawed at her resolve, but curiosity and necessity compelled her forward. They descended carefully, the cold biting at exposed skin, hearts synchronized with each crunch of snow, each distant echo of movement that may or may not have been following them. Midday brought them to a small creek, partially frozen, its surface reflecting the dull gray of the sky, yet hiding unseen dangers beneath the ice. Samuel tested each step with a sturdy branch, his instincts honed by years of cautious travel, yet the shadows across the water made Lillian's stomach twist. The reflections of the trees seemed too elongated, distorted in ways that made the familiar forest look alien. Then, as they approached a bend, the snow shifted again, this time deliberately, like a signal. From behind a cluster of skeletal trees, a figure emerged, hunched, moving slowly but unnervingly, its face obscured beneath a dark hood. Lillian's pulse spiked, and Samuel instinctively placed himself between her and the stranger, demanding answers. The figure didn't speak at first, only extended a hand, holding a small object wrapped in tattered cloth. When Samuel cautiously took it, he discovered a compass, ancient, brass, its needle spinning wildly, pointing not north, but toward some uncharted coordinate. The figure's voice, low and gravelly, finally broke the silence. This is the key, but the key is not to open a lock, it is to survive what watches. Before they could ask another question, the stranger vanished, leaving only the faint sound of rustling branches and a cold wind that smelled faintly of iron. Confused and apprehensive, Lillian and Samuel continued, the compass now guiding them, though its purpose was unclear and its erratic needle unsettling. As they climbed a steep ridge, the valley below revealed something chilling. A half-buried cabin, its roof caved, walls scarred, as if by fire or some greater force, with smoke rising faintly in a spiral that defied logic. No tracks led to or from it. Lillian froze, intuition screaming that the place was more than abandoned. It was a warning, yet the map and compass pointed directly toward it. They descended cautiously, senses sharpened, aware that one wrong step could mean capture or worse. Inside, the remnants of a fire still glowed, though no one remained. Around the hearth lay personal items, scattered: a child's shoe, a silver locket tarnished by time, and a journal whose pages were water-stained but legible. As Lillian flipped through it, the words formed a pattern, a warning, and a story of others who had tried this journey, who had vanished, leaving only clues for those who dared follow. Shadows lengthened unnaturally as the day waned, and outside, distant voices, soft, indistinct, chanting, echoed in the valley, carrying an urgency that made their hair stand on end. Lillian clutched the journal to her chest. Samuel adjusted the compass, knowing instinctively that the next hours would test every ounce of courage, cleverness, and trust between them. For every step forward in that forest, every mile closer to freedom, the past itself seemed to conspire against them, a living entity seeking to reclaim what had once escaped. They could not stop. To falter was to die, to surrender their lives to the shadows of a world built on cruelty and silence. And yet, deep in Lillian's heart, a fear stirred that even if they survived the forest, the horrors waiting beyond the ridge and the darkness that had haunted her dreams since the night of their departure might be even more merciless. Night fell faster than reason would allow, wrapping the forest in a suffocating blackness that seemed to absorb the weak glow of their lantern. Lillian and Samuel had climbed the ridge, following the erratic compass needle, until they reached a plateau where the air itself felt heavier, almost viscous, pressing against their lungs. With each breath, the wind that had once carried whispers now carried screams, or something like screams, distorted, fragmented, echoing as if bouncing off invisible walls. Lillian's hands trembled on the lantern handle. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to move independently, as though the forest itself was watching, calculating, waiting. The journal she clutched whispered warnings. The previous travelers had underestimated the valley's sentience, and they had paid the price. Samuel's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the edges of the plateau, muscles coiled, ready to act, but even he seemed unnerved, muttering that he'd never felt the forest so alive, so aware. Then they saw it far below, at the center of a hollow. A faint golden glow pulsed like a heartbeat, illuminating a building too large, too precise to be natural. Its windows shimmered in the darkness, reflecting shapes that shouldn't exist. Lillian swallowed hard. Her instinct screamed that the place had been waiting for them, that the glow was an invitation and a trap in the same breath. As they descended, the ground became treacherous. Roots snaked like serpents beneath the snow, ice sheets glittered deceptively, and every step echoed unnaturally, as if something mirrored their movements. Halfway down, Samuel stopped abruptly, pointing. In the shadow of a massive oak, a figure crouched, motionless, yet impossibly still, its form blending with the darkness. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the golden glow, and the air thickened, carrying a metallic tang, the smell of blood long dried, iron oxidizing over decades. The hairs on the back of Lillian's neck bristled. She realized the compass was no longer erratic, but pointing directly at the building, insistently, as though the forest itself had surrendered to its gravity. Every instinct screamed to turn back, yet the thrill of discovery, mingled with terror, propelled them forward. As they neared the structure, the golden light revealed details, etched symbols along the archway, spirals and jagged lines intertwined in patterns that didn't match any known language, glowing faintly as if alive. Lillian stepped closer, brushing the snow off a symbol carved in bronze, and it pulsed under her touch, warm, unnervingly human. The door creaked open, slow, deliberate, as if inviting them in, though the air smelled of rot and something far older, a decay that had accumulated centuries untouched. Inside, the main hall was vast, far larger than the exterior suggested, with ceilings vaulted high, and walls lined with mechanical contraptions, clocks, gears, pendulums, all frozen mid-motion yet humming faintly, a resonance that vibrated through their bones. In the center stood a massive clock tower mechanism, encased in glass, its hands frozen at midnight, yet a faint golden mist rose from it, drifting into the room and crawling along the floors like liquid smoke. Lillian and Samuel exchanged a glance, realizing simultaneously that the clock wasn't just a timepiece, it was a prison, a container for something too dangerous, too sentient to exist freely. Then came the sound, a ticking, but irregular, impossibly loud and echoing, like the heartbeat of the building itself, synchronized with the pulsing light. Lillian's eyes darted to the shadows along the walls where figures began to emerge, translucent at first, flickering like dying stars, forming shapes of men, women, children, all staring through her, unseen yet aware, whispering secrets of betrayal, punishment, and power. Samuel gripped her arm. Neither spoke. The golden mist thickened, swirling, forming tendrils that reached toward the figures and toward them, probing, testing, inviting. They realized the clock had been ticking underground for decades, counting down events that no living soul had comprehended. Every sound, every breath was part of a rhythm too vast for human minds. And then a single figure stepped from the mist, a woman, her face pale, eyes void of color but alight with knowledge and malice, lips moving though no words were audible. Lillian felt a compulsion, a pull to step closer, to listen, but instinct screamed the moment she obeyed would be their undoing. The clock ticked louder, and with each tick, the floor beneath them shivered, vibrating with the power of centuries of suppressed history. They were not just observers, they were participants now, witnesses to the machinery of death and memory intertwined, and they understood with icy clarity, leave, and the secret might follow them, haunting their lives forever. Stay, and the forest, the clock, and whatever had been contained would claim them as part of its eternal cadence. Lillian and Samuel stood frozen, the oppressive hum of the ancient clock machinery pressing into their very bones, each pulse resonating like a warning they couldn't ignore. The golden mists whirled tighter, forming shapes that suggested movement without actually moving, like shadows trapped in liquid. The figures along the walls shifted subtly, their ghostly forms stretching and contracting as though the hall itself breathed. Lillian's fingers itched to touch the closest figure, a small boy whose head tilted unnaturally, eyes hollow yet seeming to pierce directly into her mind. The woman at the center of the room, pale, with voided eyes that glowed faintly gold, stepped closer, and though her lips moved, the words never reached the air. Yet, inexplicably, Lillian understood. They are bound to the clock. Every tick contains their suffering, every strike measures their lives. Her stomach churned as the weight of it sank in. This was no ordinary mechanism. It was a vessel of memory, horror, and control. Samuel's voice trembled, barely audible over the low thrum of the ticking. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't a place for the living." Lillian nodded, but couldn't tear her eyes away from the pulsing heart of the hall, the clock's intricate gears. Encased in glass, each wheel etched with strange sigils that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of her eye. Time here was elastic, almost sentient. It stretched, twisted, and snapped in ways her mind could not rationalize. A sudden, sharp tick echoed through the hall, louder than any before, and the figures along the walls lurched forward, the mist swirling violently around them. Lillian stumbled backward, grabbing Samuel, trying to resist the pull of the room, but the golden mist coiled around their feet, tethering them to the ground. The pale woman's gaze bored into her, and in a moment of terrifying clarity, Lillian realized that leaving might not even be possible without becoming part of the mechanism itself. A deep, resonant gong struck from somewhere below, and the floor vibrated violently, sending dust and debris falling from the vaulted ceiling. The childlike figure that had haunted her gaze from the shadows now floated closer, hovering an inch above the wooden floor, head cocked to the side, expression unreadable but somehow accusatory. Samuel's lantern flickered and died, leaving them bathed in the sickly glow of the clock's mist, and a whispering chorus filled the room, layered voices echoing from every corner. "You carry what should remain buried." You awaken the cycle. Panic surged, but logic urged caution. Any sudden movement might trigger the machinery, release the trapped souls, or worse, summon something entirely unforeseen. Lillian forced herself to inhale, to focus, tracing the edges of the massive clock with her gaze, noting how each gear interlocked with another, forming patterns like the skeletal hands of a monstrous organism. And then, from beneath the central platform, a low rumble emerged, as though the earth itself was groaning in response to their intrusion. The ground cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of a glowing void below, swirling with golden embers and shadows of long-forgotten townsfolk, people whose lives had been measured, trapped, and transformed into energy by the clock. One figure reached up, skeletal hands brushing the edge of the glass case, their faces contorted in silent screams that echoed directly into Lillian's mind. Samuel grabbed her arm, whispering urgently, "We have to destroy it. Whatever it is, it's alive, and it's dangerous." Lillian's stomach dropped. The thought was terrifying. Destroying a mechanism older than any record, tethered to lost lives and bound to time itself, could unravel reality. But staying, she realized, meant surrendering to it, becoming part of a cycle no human could comprehend. They edged closer to the clock, every step measured, hearts hammering, aware of the eyes everywhere, watching, waiting. And then the unthinkable happened. The hands of the clock jerked violently, the golden mist surged upward, and a deafening cacophony filled the hall, voices overlapping, screaming, crying, whispering in unison. Time remembers, time consumes, time claims. The floor beneath them trembled violently, dust and splinters raining down, and for the first time, Lillian felt the full weight of history pressing down every untold story, every life erased, every soul trapped within the gears, all converging at this single, impossible moment. She glanced at Samuel, fear mirrored in his eyes, and knew instinctively that whatever decision they made next would define not just their fate, but the fate of everyone who had ever been touched by the cursed mechanism. The clock continued to tick, irregularly, impossibly fast, and the golden light intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls like living phantoms. There was no time left to hesitate. Every second brought them closer to either salvation or annihilation. The ground trembled beneath Lillian and Samuel as the golden light from the clock surged like liquid fire, illuminating the entire hall in a hue that was both beautiful and grotesque. Shadows lengthened, curling along the walls and ceiling like fingers reaching out to ensnare them, and the figures, once hovering silently, now writhed in place, their golden masks cracking and shifting, revealing glimpses of hollowed faces beneath, eyes wide and filled with despair. The whispers escalated, overlapping in a dissonant chorus that made Lillian's teeth ache, voices repeating phrases she couldn't understand, yet each syllable penetrated her mind like a needle. The cycle must continue. The cycle must feed. The cycle cannot end. Samuel gripped her arm tightly, shaking her, but she could barely focus on him. All her attention was consumed by the clock's monstrous presence. The gears spun faster, not with mechanical precision, but with an almost deliberate malice, and the sigils etched into the brass glimmered as if alive, pulsing in rhythm with the hall's heartbeat, a heartbeat that seemed to echo her own terror. Lillian's gaze drifted to the void beneath the platform, where the shadows of trapped souls twisted and churned, their cries rising in a deafening crescendo. She noticed that with each pulse, the golden mist thickened, coiling around her legs, climbing higher until it reached her waist, as if the clock itself sought to pull her into its endless interior. Samuel's voice broke through her panic, urging her toward the edge of the platform, toward the lever he had spotted, a mechanism protruding from the floorboards, rusted but clearly connected to the inner workings of the clock. If we can stop the flow, maybe we can end it, he yelled over the roar of the whispers. Lillian hesitated, terror clawing at her every instinct. Reaching toward the lever felt like stepping into the maw of a predator, yet every instinct screamed that action was necessary. She stretched her trembling hand, fingertips grazing cold metal, when a shadow leapt from the wall behind them, a figure, humanoid yet distorted, eyes glowing red through the fractured mask. Its voice a rasping echo, "Fools. Mortals. You do not understand what you meddle with." The figure lunged, and the mist surged violently, threatening to knock them off their feet. Lillian's heart thundered as Samuel shoved her aside, and together they reached the lever, hands gripping it tightly. The moment they pulled, the clock shuddered violently, emitting a scream of metal and ethereal sound that pierced every fiber of their being. The gears groaned, the shadows screamed, and the golden light flared brighter than the sun, blinding them momentarily. When their vision returned, the figures were suspended mid-air, frozen in grotesque poses, the mist swirling around them like living smoke. The void beneath the platform had begun to collapse, the golden embers spiraling upward as if trying to escape. Lillian realized with horrifying clarity that the clock was not just a machine. It was a vessel of consciousness, a prison of souls, a sentient entity feeding on time itself. And it was retaliating. Samuel's hands were shaking as he struggled to keep the lever engaged, sweat mixing with frost on his brow. Lillian could feel the immense pressure of centuries pressing down, the weight of every erased life, every hidden story, every unsolved disappearance converging on this single point. The whispers became a scream, a single word repeated with terrifying insistence: release, or be consumed. In a surge of courage and desperation, Lillian threw her full weight into the lever. The gears screeched, the hall shook violently, and the golden mist coiled upward in a tornado of light and shadow. The figures let out a unified, bone-chilling scream, faces twisted in anguish, golden masks shattering like fragile glass. The floorboards cracked, the platform tilted, and the void below began to swallow the lower parts of the hall. For a moment, time seemed to suspend. The clock ticked slower, then faster, then paused entirely. And then, as if obeying some final command, the gears ground to a halt, the golden light extinguished, the shadows collapsed into the floor, and the whispers died. Silence, thick and suffocating, replaced the roar. Lillian and Samuel collapsed to the ground, shaking, hearts pounding, eyes wide with disbelief. The clock still stood, inert, its glass casing cracked, gears frozen. But the malevolent presence felt diminished, as though it had been starved, broken, or at least momentarily tamed. The hall was still. The void beneath the platform had sealed, leaving only a faint golden residue shimmering like dust in the dim light. They had survived, but the weight of what they had unleashed and what they had nearly become part of pressed upon them with an unbearable intensity. The once hidden horrors of the clock remained, buried but not destroyed, a reminder that some histories are too dark, too bold, and too alive to be erased, no matter how much time passes. The hall was silent, but the air itself vibrated with the memory of what had just occurred, a residue of soundless screams lingering like smoke in the corners. Lillian and Samuel sat on the cold wooden floor, backs pressed against a support beam, chest heaving, hands trembling, unable to speak. Even the golden mist that had threatened to engulf them now hung as a faint, luminescent residue, curling around the beams and floorboards as if watching, waiting, outside, through the broken windows. The mountains loomed dark and silent, the snow still falling, but the world felt altered. Time itself seemed slower, heavy, and thick, pressing in on them with every breath. Lillian dared a glance at the clock. It was still, its gears frozen, the malevolent heartbeat gone, yet she could feel the weight of the centuries pressing down from within it, a palpable presence that seemed to seep into her skin. Samuel, finally breaking the silence, whispered, "It's over." "Isn't it?" Lillian didn't answer. She couldn't. The photograph in her hand, the one that had brought them here, had changed again. The golden masked figures were gone, replaced by a swirling void that pulsed faintly in sync with the dormant clock. The child from before, the one who had warned them, now appeared in the photograph's corner, eyes hollow yet impossibly alive, and a single phrase carved into the fogged edges: "Do not forget." Lillian's stomach churned. They had survived the clock, but it had not released its hold entirely. Some part of it, some consciousness, some fragment of the souls trapped within, remained, and it would wait. It would remember. It would act again. "We need to leave," Samuel said, his voice shaking, "before it wakes." Fully, they gathered their courage, hauling themselves to their feet, stepping carefully across the warped wooden floor. Every step felt like a negotiation with unseen forces, the floorboards creaking under a weight that wasn't entirely their own. As they reached the hall's entrance, a soft whisper reached their ears, not from the room, not from the hall, but from beneath the floorboards, from the clock itself. Lillian froze. The whisper, so soft, so deliberate, said one thing: "You cannot leave. You carry time within you now." Panic surged, but Samuel grabbed her hand, pulling her into the hall's corridor. The snow outside seemed to beckon them, promising freedom if they could just reach it. Yet the moment they stepped outside, the world shifted subtly, the mountains warping in ways that shouldn't be possible, trails looping back upon themselves, snow-covered paths leading them in circles. Every instinct screamed they were being herded, manipulated by the clock's influence extending beyond its brass and glass prison. Lillian tried to shout, but the words froze in her throat. The very air seemed thickened, heavy with centuries of trapped time. They ran blindly through the frost-bitten forest, guided only by the fading light and the sense of urgency pressing from within their own bones. Behind them, through the skeletal trees, a faint glow pulsed intermittently, golden, rhythmic, a heartbeat in the darkness. It followed them, almost alive, bending around the trunks and rocks, teasing their eyes with glimpses of the horrors that lurked beneath. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time itself refused to be counted. Their lungs burned, legs screamed, and yet no matter how far they ran, the glow remained at the periphery of vision, a constant reminder that the clock's influence had reached beyond its chamber. When they finally stumbled onto a dirt road that seemed impossibly modern against the 1800s architecture they had escaped, the glow disappeared, the forest behind them silent and empty. Yet the photograph in Lillian's hand was now warm, almost pulsating. And etched faintly into the fogged edges, where the child had been, appeared a new phrase: "Your journey has begun. Time follows." Lillian swallowed hard. She didn't know. All she knew was that the clock, the souls trapped within it, and the kingdom it had destroyed were not finished with them. The past was not past. Time was alive, and it was hunting. The forest road stretched ahead like an endless ribbon of ice and shadow, but Lillian and Samuel's steps felt heavier than ever, burdened not only by exhaustion but by the knowledge that the clock's influence had followed them beyond its chamber. Every so often, the photograph in Lillian's hand pulsed faintly, golden light flickering as if the trapped souls within were breathing, observing, waiting. She dared not look behind, but the subtle shifting of shadows among the trees told her everything she needed to know. The air itself carried whispers, echoes of a kingdom lost to time, voices threading together in a chorus of despair and warning. They stumbled into a clearing where moonlight broke through the skeletal canopy, illuminating the ruins of what seemed like an abandoned homestead. Yet even here the light carried a golden tinge, faint and unearthly, and for a moment Lillian could swear she saw figures moving in the corners of her vision, glimpses of men and women frozen mid-step, their faces blank, eyes hollowed by centuries of suspended memory. Samuel whispered, "It's still here. It's everywhere." Lillian clutched the photograph tighter, feeling warmth seep into her palm as if the clock itself were communicating through it. They continued, the snow crunching beneath their feet, every step taking them farther from the forest, yet deeper into the feeling of being hunted by time itself. Hours or perhaps days passed, the boundary between night and day blurring as the cold gnawed at their bodies, yet the golden glow never fully left their periphery. Finally, they reached the edge of a river, its surface frozen and glittering under the moon. A rickety bridge spanned the water, swaying in the windless night, and as they crossed it, Lillian noticed the faint outline of a city on the horizon, impossibly anachronistic streets and buildings from different centuries stacked upon one another in a way that defied logic. She realized then that the clock's reach was not limited to Briarwood Colony or its ruins. It had fractured time itself, creating pockets where history lingered, twisted and trapped. Samuel stumbled, nearly falling into the icy water, and Lillian grabbed him, pulling him back with a force that felt guided, purposeful, as though unseen hands were steering them toward a destination not of their choosing. As they reached the other side, a sudden gust of wind carried the metallic scent of the clock sharp and acrid, filling their lungs with memories not their own, screams, laughter, decrees of kings, the cries of children, all layered together like echoes inside a cavern too vast to comprehend. Lillian's vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment she saw the clock itself, enormous and impossibly intricate, its hands spinning wildly, gears interlocking with buildings, trees, and rivers. The golden masked figures appeared again, standing along the horizon, their faces cracked, eyes ablaze, and the child, always the child, stood at the center, stitched mouth opening, whispering, "Time remembers. It always remembers." Lillian felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, though no one was there. Samuel screamed, dropping the photograph, which landed on the ice and glowed brighter than ever. The ice beneath it cracked, golden light spilling into the river, and for the first time the two of them understood. The clock had not merely killed a kingdom, it had absorbed it, preserved it, and carried it forward like a living entity. The photograph's light flared one last time, and the frozen figures seemed to bow toward it, then dissipate into the night air, leaving Lillian and Samuel alone on the riverbank. Silence fell thick, suffocating, and absolute. Yet as they turned to leave, Lillian noticed that the photograph had changed once more. A new image, a new location, coordinates that would lead them further into the clock's web, further into history's dark, relentless embrace. She looked at Samuel, fear and a mirrored in his eyes. "It's not over," she whispered. "It's only begun." And with that, the wind carried a single sound, the ticking of a clock, faint, distant, yet unmistakable, echoing underground, through mountains, rivers, and centuries, reminding them that some histories cannot be buried and some horrors never end. The world around them resumed its normal rhythms, but they knew, with a chill that settled into their bones, that time itself had become a predator and they were now its prey.